The Gospel of Mark, Structure and Christology, Part 2. Unlike the Gospel of Matthew, which is relatively well structured, the Gospel of Mark apparently demonstrates no strict, visible framework. Scholars have tried hard to discern a structure intrinsic to Mark with varying degrees of success and often conflicting results depending upon their point of view. However, almost all would agree that the Gospel can be divided into three stages. First is from chapter 1 to 13, then chapter 1 14 to chapter 8 27, and then chapter 8 27 to chapter 16 8, with Peter's declaration of Jesus in 8:27 that he is the Messiah. The structure of Mark's section 1, the introduction, who is Jesus? Where does he come from? From chapter 1, verse 1 to 13. Section 2 is the progressive revelation of the mystery of Jesus' messiahship, that is chapter 1, 14 to chapter 8, 30. How does Jesus bring about the kingdom of God? By calling the disciples, through conflict with the evil one and exorcisms, and through healings. If Jesus is from God and came to preach the kingdom of God, why was there conflict between him and the Jews? Because he was upsetting the social standards of what is clean and what is profane, forgiving of sins which only God can do, eating and dining with tax collectors and sinners who were considered unclean, not following the prescribed fasts of the Jewish law, breaking the Sabbath, doing work on Sabbath, questioning the Sabbath, and exerting his authority over the Sabbath. Second, manifestation in parabolic teaching and stupendous miracles, the formation of Jesus' community. Who is a true disciple of Jesus? What does it mean to be a true disciple of Jesus? The calling of the 12 disciples was to be with him. Disciples, in contrast to the scribes and the family, true disciples are those who do the will of God, in contrast to those who are prejudiced against him and who reject him. If everyone is called, why do some people reject Jesus? Why are we an oppressed, persecuted minority? Is there a future? What can we do? How does Jesus form the disciples into a community? Jesus explains in parable the different responses of people. Do not be afraid if you are small or minority. It will grow in ways unknown to you like a mustard seed. Some will understand, some do not understand. Jesus explains parables to the disciples. Jesus forms his community by demonstrating three big miracles through his chosen disciples: calming of the ocean, rooming of the legion of evil spirits, and raising the dead to life. And yet Jesus' family and hometown reject him because they have no faith. They form an inclusion with the family that is mentioned in chapter 3 verses 20 to 35 and a contrast the disciples of Jesus. These disciples of Jesus have faith and who will be sent out on mission with the same authority as Jesus has. Jesus' self-disclosure to his disciples. Who is Jesus? What does Jesus reveal about himself to the disciples? Jesus' identity can only be understood in mission, that is, the disciples being sent out through suffering. They will suffer the same fate as John the Baptist. Jesus inaugurates the Messianic Banquet. He is like the Moses who gives bread from heaven. Jesus is greater than Moses because he can walk over the sea and reveals himself, "It is I," to the disciple. Jesus is even greater than the existing Jewish ritualism. Jesus is also coming for the Gentiles, demonstrating his universalism, healing of the Syrophoenician woman in Tyre, messianic miracles of the deaf man, feeding the 4,000 in a Gentile territory. Yet the disciples do not understand, and the question remains, why did the disciples still not understand? Jesus cures the blind man at Bethsaida. This is a healing in stages. First fully blind, and partially blind and fully sight restored. Hence a symbolic miracle depicting the understanding of his disciples. Revelation of Jesus, their understanding in stages until Peter's final revelation that Jesus is the Messiah. However, this revelation is insufficient. It does not tell us what type of Messiah Jesus is, whether it's political or spiritual Messiah. Finally, section 3, the progressive revelation of the mystery of the suffering of the Son of Man, from chapter 8:27 to chapter 16:8. The way of the Son of Man and the discipleship. What is the nature of Jesus' messiahship? Jesus is a suffering Messiah, and this is reinforced by the 3 passion predictions, and he will have to go through passion, death, and resurrection. What disciples are we meant to be? Christian discipleship is following Jesus on the way by being faithful, by taking up our cross and following Jesus, by losing one's life, by being a servant like a little child, by renouncing all attachments, and by trusting in God. This is a well-constructed theological section. It contains 2 illusions, the healing story of blindness and secondly the phrase "on the way" demarcates the section in the beginning and at the end. The focus of this journey is the journey of Jesus and his disciples from Caesarea Philippi in the north to Jerusalem in the south. On this journey, Jesus instructs them about discipleship and reveals to them the type of Messiah he will be. By combining spatial and literary techniques, Mark re-emphasizes the identity of Jesus and the demands of discipleship through the three passion predictions. Here we have the three passion predictions, first in chapter 8, then chapter 9, and third in chapter 10. Then the incomprehension of the disciples, first in chapter 8, 32 to 33, then in chapter 9, 32 to 34, and then in chapter 10, 35 to 37. And then the instruction on discipleship. Three instructions, first in chapter 8, 34 to chapter 9, 1. Then second instruction is chapter 9, 35 to 37, and third instruction to the disciples is chapter 10, verses 38 to 45. This is the main theological insight. Jesus' way to Jerusalem is the way of suffering, leading to the cross. Jesus is the suffering Son of Man. Jesus, the suffering Son of Man, goes ahead on the way built by God, whereas the disciples fail to follow him. The transfiguration place immediately after the first passion prediction serves to confirm through a divine revelation Jesus' new affirmation about himself and his mission. Jesus' understanding of himself is in continuity with God's will for himself. The failure of the disciples to perform a miracle, on the other hand, demonstrate very visibly their incomprehension and unbelief. They do not understand God's will for Jesus, while Jesus continuously acts according to God's will. The session ends with the incomprehension of the disciple demonstrated request of James and John and Jesus' invitation to them to drink the cup of suffering. Finally, the blind man Bartimaeus believes in Jesus, is cured of his blindness in contrast to the blindness of the disciples, and followed Jesus on his way to Jerusalem. Revelation in Jerusalem and a definitive break with the Jews. How did Jesus' end come about? The mystery of Jesus in Jerusalem. The focus on this section is on the temple. Of the 9 occurrences of temple or Hieron in Mark, 8 are found in this section. The question in this section seemed to center on the relationship of early Christianity to the temple and to the Jewish religion. The questions of the early Christians were, where are we to pray if we are not allowed in the temple, or if the temple is destroyed? Are only Jews allowed to pray? What is the relationship of Christianity to Judaism and to the state, that is Roman state? Are we to carry on with the Jewish law, or do we require a new interpretation of the law? Similarly, Jesus continues to teach his disciples further about himself through the parable of the wicked tenants, where he reveals himself as God's Son. This section uses spatio-temporal categories to bring out its message. Jesus' ministry in Jerusalem is spread over 3 days. Every day Jesus enters the city and the temple, A, undertakes some activity in the temple, B, and then exits from the temple, A-, and his departure from Jerusalem to Bethany. It is a literary device known as sandwich composition, dovetail structure, or intercalation. While spread over 3 days, Jesus progressively reveals himself at the temple each day, increasing day by day, often in relation to the Jewish religion and to the temple. Day 1, a searching, looking at everything in the temple. Day 2, Jesus drives out the dealers from the temple. Jesus is teaching in the temple. Then authority of John the Baptist, paradigmatic to the Jesus' own authority. Jesus as God's beloved Son and his final and definitive envoy. Jesus' unique insight about God and the relationship between humans and God. Jesus, both the Son and the Lord of David. Significance of the Son of Man means for Jerusalem and for the Christians. The end of Jesus, finally fulfillment and the culmination of the mystery, passion, death and resurrection of the Son of Man. The central event is the condemnation of Jesus to death by the Sanhedrin and is framed by Peter following Jesus from a distance and is denying Jesus thrice. This intercalcation demonstrates the contrast between Jesus' commitment and the disciples' incomprehension and rejection of Jesus. At the crux is a Christological assertion by Jesus when questioned by the Sanhedrin. Notice how he directly says, I am. Now this is apart from the historical fact that Jesus was put to death by the Romans as a Messianic pretender. Instead, Mark puts the blame on the Sanhedrin who condemned Jesus to death. This is the central verse in the full of the section. It is preceded by 63 verses and 14:1 to 63, and it is followed by 63 verses 14:65 to 16:8. So, as we conclude from the Christological point of view, another passage becomes more important. It is only when Jesus dies on the cross that a Roman centurion finally declares that truly this man was God's son. It is only at the death of Jesus that we recognize who Jesus truly is.